Yes. That's a lot of stuff. Okay.
I'll
Just
go.
moved in for shooting.
Yes, thing was.
Like, you go here a lot and we have to.
Okay, thank you. All right, welcome everyone. Good to see you all, old friends and new friends, and so on. We're going to be talking, and many, by the way, many among the audience are well aware of the methods of reporting and so on. So this event is focused, or it's going to talk about Western media and Israel's war of genocide on Gaza, culpability or ignorance. And it's a big topic, but it's also a stark topic. I mean, we could see it and feel it every day. We have, really wonderful speakers. You could talk about them for a very long time. We have Sana, and Sana is an award-winning DC-based journalist and media critic, previously with Al Jazeera, where she hosted the media series Backspace and the Occupation Style Guide. So we can talk about Sana again for a long time, but we choose not to because we want to discuss. And second, we have Prem, a colleague and a friend. He and I, encountered the audacities of the spokespeople at the State Department time and time again. And Prem is with Zeto News, and that's the proper pronunciation, right? Zetio, okay. He's a political correspondent where he covers foreign policy, corruption, civil rights, immigration, and the environment. And third, we have joining us via the satellite, via Zoom or whatever, it is Sana Asal. Asal is in California. She's Asal Rad. She is, if you are on Twitter, you can see her all the time. They're correcting the headlines. So she's really well qualified to talk about this too. She's putting the proper headline. Asal is a historian of the modern Middle East and a non-resident fellow at Arab Center in Washington, D.C. She works on research and writing related to U.S. foreign policy issues, the Middle East, contemporary Iran and Israel, Palestine. Asal completed a PhD in history from the University of California, Irvine, my old stomping grounds, and is the author of The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran, which is the Cambridge Press. And we're going to turn to our speakers real quick, but I just want to say that, we see this genocide is really ongoing. I mean, there's this voluminous things that we can see every day. I mean, we can see this act of killing civilians and so on going on in so many different methods. I mean, the Israelis are, just coming up with so many different ways. But our focus is really the Western media. Last week alone, there were two articles, of course, that were major in the New York Times. There was an article by Bartab, by I think Omer Bartab, a historian and a professor at Brown University. And the title of the article, a lengthy article, says, I'm a genocide expert and I know genocide when I say it. So it's really right there, all the evidence that you want, basically to present that genocide is ongoing. And then there was, of course, a dossier, the dossier about the New York Times and how it ignores and how it covers for Israel and so on. So there's a great deal of material that we will discuss. And without further ado, we will begin with Sana.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
It is on. Okay, great. Please excuse, I have a bit of a remnant of a cough, so please excuse that if I happen to choke on my mic at some point. So there is so much, of course, to talk about, and I don't want to take up too much time with a monologue or anything of that sort, because I'd like for all of us to, ask questions to one another and also, of course, answer questions that you all may have. But I will say this, I've been a working journalist now for about 15, a little over 15 years now. And I became a journalist specifically as a result of the coverage of the post 9/11 coverage and specifically the coverage leading up to the invasion of Iraq. I was a teenager then, and I very vividly remember what it was like turning on the news every single night and seeing the way that not only were how Arabs and Muslims were being depicted, but how Iraqis in particular also were being depicted. How who was being brought on to speak about Iraq, who was being brought on to promote the idea of war, even if they were Iraqi themselves, right? And I remember as a child witnessing that and was very compelled and to think about more, how are we talking about other communities? How are we how are journalists in particular enmeshing themselves with, the American power structure in order to further American interests? And a weird thing for like a teenager to think about, but that's what it was like in the early 2000s. And I will say that, institutions uphold institutions. When we look at and when we think about Western news media, and specifically, I'm going to talk about US news media, right, to even narrow it down even more, because when we talk about Western news media, that goes across countries. But I'm going to talk specifically about US news media. Institutions in this country uphold one another because they know and they understand that legitimacy lies in upholding their own legitimacy lies in upholding the legitimacy of other institutions. And we find that the US news media does this again and again and again. This is not unique to its relationship with the US government. It's also, for instance, the way that US news media will cover crime in this country. It will elevate and always give preferential treatment to, for instance, the police, the institution of the police. So even the way we understand crime in this country, petty crime or whatever you want to call it, is very much so dictated by how our news media enmeshes itself with another institution, which is the institution of the police. Our news media in this country is deeply, deeply enmeshed with the institution of foreign policy. Very rarely do we find instances, especially in the last 30 to 40 years, right, which is kind of where I tend to do my research is in this timeline. Very rarely do we find any significant, or really any, I would say, pushback to US foreign policy interests and goals, no matter who is in power in the administration. That doesn't matter. What we find is that sometimes, sure, there's a little bit of like a pushback, maybe a critique, but like a little bit here, like, oh, maybe he could have said it differently, could have done this differently. But what we find again and again is no matter what happens, the US news media always falls in line. What was so almost unique, or at least ostensibly on the outside, what was almost so unique about what US news coverage looked like after October 2023, or in October 2023 and onwards, was that we found that the US news media was not only enmeshing itself, again, in US foreign policy interests, which is, of course, what Israel is. We have to understand Israel as a primary US foreign policy interest, although many will argue that in many ways it has maybe outrun that utility for American foreign policy. But we saw that it was also enmeshing itself in the institution of another country, which was the Israeli military, right? And that is shocking. But it's only shocking, again, if we don't understand how even the Israeli military and its interests are an extension of US military interests and foreign policy interests. The coverage of, and I don't say this lightly, the first 3 months of coverage of the US-backed Israeli genocide of Palestinians were, in my opinion, worse than what we saw in over a year and a half of propaganda, of American news propaganda in the lead up to the Iraq War, which is saying a lot. If you remember what that was like, the first 3 months were horrific. And they were not simply horrific because, of what was being ignored, but also what was being propagated, the stories that were being propagated. Everything always came back, right, to October 7th, October 7th, October 7th, but it was also who was being brought in to tell the stories. It was not just, oh, family members of hostages. It was Israeli commander after Israeli commander, right? And they were allowed to say anything. Our media gave it representatives of Israeli institutions a carte blanche to say and justify absolutely everything. I still vividly remember, I'm forgetting his name, but now he does like all the media rounds. He's like a regular on Piers Morgan as well. Surprise, surprise. But he's a former Israeli commander, and he was being interviewed by CNN's Abby Phillip, and he sat there and said, there are no innocents in Gaza. This was in October, all right, of 2023. Do you think Abby Phillip pushed back? No, they never push back. They barely push back even now. And we see that again and again and again. And what we've seen over the last, we're hitting 2 years of this genocide. What we've seen for 2 years is a news media landscape that has not only that has not only justified every single unfathomable crime and cruelty against the Palestinians under the guise of journalism, but has also in the process tried to hide it. Currently, Palestinians, I mean, people use the number 2 million, but we all know that number, it's 2.2 million. There were 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza before the genocide. Currently, I mean, the estimates of Palestinians who've been killed, the conservative estimate is 60,000, right? We've seen medical journals and studies that have said that number easily is upwards of 150,000, easily. And that's as a result of not just the bombings, but also diseases, starvation, which now is getting worse, right? Like now we have experts on food scarcity and famine who are talking about that the mortality rates are about to exponentially increase. And we're going to see a far more slaughtered Palestinians as a result of that. And not just the coming weeks and months, in the coming days. And the primary victims of this starvation are going to be children. Already, a Iraq body count mentioned today that of the 100 or so people who've been killed, who've been killed by starvation thus far, 80 of them are children. Children have taken the brunt of the atrocities in this genocide. But even though we are now in this moment, this current Israeli aggression of starvation begins, quote unquote, right, in March of 2025, which is when Israel broke the ceasefire. But if you've been following this, you know that is not when, of course, the starvation began. From day one, Israel has used a policy of starvation, which it has worsened in stages over 2 years. But when we look at the coverage right now, what does it look like? What would it make you think that this starvation just started? Even though if you've been following this, you know that this was a policy that was backed by the Biden administration, that no one in our news media questioned. I very famously remember the article by Isaac Chotiner in the New Yorker, and he was interviewing, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman, but it was a representative from the World Health Organization. And the article title was called "Gaza is Starving," which is actually a really good summary of how the policy of starvation, the Israeli policy of starvation, has been covered in U.S. news media, which is that, and in general, how Israeli atrocities against Palestinians have always been covered, even before 2023, which is that horrible things happen to Palestinians. Who knows who does them? We don't name the perpetrators. We don't name the murderers. We don't name the killers. We don't name the people who are starving them. And in that article, Israel wasn't mentioned once. It was an interview, thousands of words. I'm sure a lot of you guys are also probably familiar with Isaac Chotiner's, very famous interviews in the New Yorker right now that he's done over the past 2 years. Israel wasn't mentioned once by either. And so all of that to say is that even this moment that we find ourselves in, we've seen that for almost 2 years, our news media has ignored purposely what Israel has done, backed by the United States, and who has done it, right? And of course, I'm sure you guys are aware that former State Department Representative Stacey Gilbert came out and revealed that she and others had presented former Secretary of State Antony Blinken with reports about Israel is using starvation as a weapon against Palestinians, and of course how that then necessitates that the United States cease sending arms to Israel. And what happened? Antony Blinken went in front of Congress and said there's no evidence to suggest that Israel is purposely starving Palestinians. How much coverage did that get in our news media? Right? So that's a lot that I've said, but I just wanted to, really highlight, especially that point as we're in the middle of what is undoubtedly and unfortunately irreversible death, which is coming to Palestinians. That's the stage we're at right now. We talk about stage 5 malnutrition, which is the last stage of famine and malnutrition. That's when there is irreversible cognitive and cognitive and physical, meaning organ damage, that no amount of food that you eat can fix. And all of this is absolutely is in large part as a result, due to the result of the coverage, which has again simultaneously justified every single atrocity and cruelty against Palestinians, but also hidden it from us as well.
Thank you. Very compelling presentation, and move to Prem.
Well, firstly, very well said. I think you open up a lot of buckets that I hope we get into all of them in our Q&A. I will keep it brief by saying that I am 26 years old. And so what you referred to of the lead up to the Iraq War, I was neither mature enough nor old enough to really digest in any significant manner. And I bring that up to say that when you talk about that, the first few month period after October 2023, I remember thinking to myself how profoundly insane everything felt so quickly in terms of how the story was already being locked, sealed, and delivered to the masses. And I had recalled as time went on and hopes for a ceasefire or some semblance of any forward trajectory towards the violence ending continued to wither away. The more that continued, the more it became clear how insane it got, how quickly it got, in such a way that what maybe people a little bit older than me got to experience over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years was jam-packed so compactly into weeks and months in a way that I think in some parts it's just because of how we engage with the news nowadays, how we are instantly scrolling past it all the time, but in large part because of how it was packaged by those news creators. And one lesson I think that has been eminently clear to me in the past nearly 2 years that, as you mentioned, can be seen in how crime is covered in America or how corporate behavior is covered in America, but particularly how the question and issue of Israel and Palestine is covered in America, is that there is this question that we often have about double standards, about fair and equitable coverage towards all entities involved in the question of Israel and Palestine. The issue that we are coming up against over and over and over again, whether it's with regards to how student protesters are treated versus their administrators or the weapons companies that they're protesting, whether it's regards to Rashida Tlaib and pro-Israel members of Congress, how they're treated when Rashida Tlaib, for instance, is censored for saying from the river to the sea, my people will be free from Israeli occupation, and how she is immediately censored and castigated for that, versus how one new member of Congress named Randy Fine can call several members of Congress Muslim terrorists, can say let them starve with regards to 2 million people who are being bombed at this very moment, and receives no condemnation. The issue that we see here is that that's not a double standard. A double standard is what happens when two different people do the same thing and they get unequal treatment. If Rashida Tlaib and Randy Fine both had called for the mass starvation of a people that's currently being bombed, and one was censored and one was not, that's a double standard. But when one person is begging, as the only Palestinian member of Congress, for her colleagues to not vote to mass kill her people, and she is censored for that, and then a little under 2 years later, a member of Congress indeed calls for more genocide towards her people, and he is not held accountable for that. That is not a double standard. That is a second layer of inhumanity such that the asymmetries of everything around us is made totally clear. And those asymmetries are not mystical, are not indiscernible because of what Sana is laying out, which is that institutions have motivations, and the other institutions surrounding those institutions have their motivations to validate those institutions. These asymmetries are baked into every single aspect of how this issue has been covered in the past 21 months in such a way that, on one hand, it is indeed insanity inducing. It is depressing in very simple terms. But at the same time, such insanity can only go on for so long in a public ecosystem for which it is unsurprising that up to this point, most people in this country have bought into that because that is all they've been surrounded by over and over and over again. But there comes a point, and we are seeing that point where in this country, people for whom they have no connection to Israel or Palestine, they maybe don't know that many Jewish or Muslim people even, and yet they are beginning to question what exactly is going on here, because these insanities are so overwhelmingly inconceivable. And so we are caught in this dynamic, I think that many of you are familiar with, where on a daily basis, we're surrounded by the deluge of horrors that are happening in Gaza. And at the same time, the more those occur, the more it is very clear that in this country there is a remarkable shift in public opinion on this question in a way that hasn't been seen perhaps in modern American history in such a quick and rapid way that does seem to be attached to some sort of political project and some political means. But we're always oscillating between those moments of hope that the American public and the Western world is starting to become not just uncomfortable, but untenable in their relationship to unconditionally backing this apartheid government. But at the same time, until we reach the actual material breaking point, we are seeing the daily horrors of that state. And that's not all to get to any conclusion. It's just to say that these are the dynamics that we're operating within. And it's difficult and it's horrible. It's horrible just as an observer. And we're just observers. We are not in Gaza nor the West Bank. And I mean, to your point, we think about how, in some respects, it feels like for some, the starvation has only really just begun because of how it's been covered up to this point. But when you just think of the testimony we've received this week from humanitarians, from journalists, from the Palestinian people themselves, this has to be the breaking point. And I know we've said that again and again and again, not just for the past 2 years, but for the past 7 decades and beyond. There really comes a point where you don't know how much further you could even imagine. And this week is certainly an example of that. To the point that even Western outlets, some of which at certain points maybe were in fact culpable in whitewashing what was going on, they themselves have issued strong statements today. The BBC, Reuters, AP, the AFP, some of which I will say have incredible journalists. But as we know, some of these institutions, at the end of the day, can fall short of what we would like to see. But all to say, even they have had to issue strong statements saying, this is too much. Our own journalists are in the same lines that the Palestinian people are in at these so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites, in which we know implicitly, if not explicitly, that these are not humanitarian sites, that for many of these people, they are in fact death sentences. That there are videos this week of people in Palestine coming home to their families, cheering not just because they got a bag of flour, but because they came back at all. And so these are the dynamics wherein I'm sorry that we are in them. I'm sorry that some of our colleagues have helped lead us here. But rest assured, I would be remiss not to say that we're lucky to be surrounded by people like Saeed and Sana and Asal, wherever she is in the ether, if she's like watching somewhere, who are very, very good at what they do and who teach us what proper, adequate, sufficient coverage can be. And I hope some of our colleagues in the industry can learn from you guys too, because I know I sure have. And so if nothing else, I am grateful to be in the space with people who are really sharpening us to really think about how we can cover this issue in such a way that we dismantle and abolish those deep asymmetries that we were talking about. And if nothing else, honor the humanity of people for whom their humanity has received no such honor up to this point.
Thank you, Prem. Prem brings to the briefing room every time, the kind of honest journalistic ethics and energy that really impact the room. Sure, we don't get any answers, but they are there. I mean, and that is the change. This is the change is happening. And now we go to our speaker virtually, Asal Rad. Welcome, Asal. We are honored to have you, and we wish that you were here in person, but we understand. So with that, we're going to go to you virtually. There we go. Yeah. Can you hear us?
Yeah, it's funny because I watched myself lower, so it was
Okay.
very interesting to see. And sorry to Prem and Sana for having to move you to the sides. First, I wanted to thank everybody for including me in this, especially via Zoom. It's always an honor to share a space with Prem, with Sana, and with Saeed. And I spent, we're talking about the media and we're talking about journalists and we're talking about press, but it's really important to always point out that there are 3 journalists sitting right there who do an amazing job. This is not about the criticisms are less about individual journalists. There are certainly problematic journalists, but it's less about individual journalists and it is more about institutions. Those institutions that are tied, that are corporate, that work for profit. They're a for-profit industry, and that should tell us something about why they operate the way that they do. And the fact that those institutions are tied to power. And so they reflect whatever people in positions of power are saying. But it was always, great to watch the department briefings, the State Department briefings, and have examples like Saeed and like Prem there, where even though, as Saeed just said, they didn't get answers, but they challenged. They challenged what spokespeople like Matthew Miller were saying, because that, to me, is the job of the journalist. It's to challenge state narratives. It's to challenge government officials and other officials to get to the truth, not to be stenographers for what officials are saying, but to make sure that they're actually uncovering the truth. That's sort of the, as someone who is not a journalist, but has have grown up reading papers and reading online news, that's the image of journalism, the investigative journalist, someone who goes out and finds the truth of the story. And what we've seen, and Sana and Prem have already talked about this, and I don't want to repeat their points, but what we've seen in the last 22 months is the opposite of that. And it's not just the last 22 months, of course. Sana talked about the Iraq War. I think we're the same age. I'm going to age myself as well and say, I think I was a teenager as well when that happened. And it was so informative in the way that it developed my own political outlook to have watched those events unfold in real time. And I don't think that's unique to people of our generation. I think for a lot of people who were young when that was happening, there was a sort of fall from grace, not only of the officials that maybe you naively believed were honest, but especially of the press, because you believed that that was the role that they played in a free society. We talk about the free press in the West and how important that is, versus the authoritarian state narratives that you see from press that have limited restrictions in other countries. And this is something that we champion in the West and especially in the United States, and yet that's not the role that they played in manufacturing consent for the war in Iraq. And what do we mean by that? I want to sort of break this down very, very quickly to understand what role does the media play and why is that role significant? Well, everyone in the public is not going to be an expert on Middle Eastern history or individual countries in the region. That expectation would be absurd. We're not experts in many fields, and that's why the public gets a lot of their information, their perception, what shapes their views from the media, from news sites. They're expecting that these are honest reports and that they're telling them the truth. And so this is how their opinions are being formed. So for instance, if you go back to 2002 and 2003, the American public predominantly believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which we know that they didn't, and that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11, which we know that he wasn't. So how do you explain this gap between facts and people's opinions? Like, why do people think this? Fast forward to another poll in 2021 about Iran and Israel. The majority of the American public believes falsely that Iran has nuclear weapons and doesn't know that Israel has nuclear weapons. Again, basic facts. Iran has no nuclear weapons, Israel does, but the public has that reversed. Fast forward to the Gaza genocide. I think it was in February or March of last year. There was a poll where half of Americans couldn't name who had been killed more, Palestinians or Israelis by that point. And we had tens of thousands of Palestinians who had already been killed. So how do you explain a complete lack of basic facts and knowledge in the public? You can blame the public. We can say that Americans are ignorant or they're not educated. And this is the kind of trope that's often used to talk about where public opinion comes from. But that tells you something about the media and how they are presenting information to the public. That is what explains this massive gap. Because if they were getting information correctly, they would be forming different opinions. It's not a coincidence that in all of the examples that I gave, US adversaries were the bad guys and US allies were the good guys. They didn't do anything wrong. They're the victims, perpetually the victims. It's because it's playing into the very narratives of power, and that is not the role of media. The role of media, the role of journalism is, again, and this can't be emphasized enough, to tell the truth. And something Prem said was very important towards the end about we saw a statement today, a joint statement from BBC, Reuters, AFP, and AP, urging Israel to allow aid, acknowledging the fact that Israel is the culprit behind why there is starvation, actually acknowledging their Palestinian colleagues, finally acknowledging their Palestinian colleagues. And this might seem, it is important. And I'll emphasize, I don't think that it lacks importance. I think it's indicative of a shifting tide. Somewhat what Prem was talking about, this idea that we reach these thresholds where the public is so appalled by what they are seeing on a daily basis that finally these institutions have to come around. But something to keep in mind is no matter what, these institutions, even if from today on, which they won't, by the way, but let's just assume, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, that starting today, they will call it a genocide, they will acknowledge Israel's responsibility, and this is how we're going to move forward. Again, not likely, but assuming so. They are still culpable. What has happened in Gaza can't simply be undone. That's what makes it a genocide. You can't undo it. The destruction, 92% of residential buildings being destroyed or damaged. That is not something that's going to be easy to put back together, but it has to be rebuilt. And what also has to be rebuilt with Gaza is a system that was supposed to prevent this very atrocity, this genocide from happening. Those institutions have to be held accountable. That's part of the process of rebuilding. So even if you hear them changing their tunes now, accountability includes the propagandists that helped facilitate the atrocities that we've seen over the last 22 months.
Thank you, thank you, Prem, and thank you, Sanaa. And great deal has been said. And, the Western media, and I can speak about the American media. I'm not really an expert in what's going on in Germany or France and so on, but I know the American media. I've been here for many decades and so on. And I can tell you, it's part of the establishment. It is part of basically, forwarding the ideas, the ethos, and the interest of the establishment, or this hyper capitalist system in many ways. But it also racist. It is also racist. And I'm going to talk about Iraq a little bit because I spent 5 years in Iraq. So, but listen to what Richard Daggett, I think his last name was Daggett, the CBS guy, who said, when he went to Ukraine, he said, but these refugees are different. They're live, they have blue eyes and so on. We all remember that, right? They're not like the refugees from Syria, not the refugees from Iraq. I mean, he said that on air. He said that, for the whole world to hear and so on. And he's still there reporting. And imagine if this was said about something else, all hell would have broken loose. So they are complicit and they cover for each other. And, American media, and I hope I don't take too long in saying this, going back to to early on, I mean, since the state was created and so on, the United States invaded Haiti 15 times. They sent troops to Haiti 15 times, and every time it was defended in the U.S. media. Nobody talked about the atrocities and so on, or the other, atrocities that they committed. And Iraq, and I am an old man, so I was, in the lead up to the war, and I remember, for instance, at Brookings, they had something every Thursday that they called the Iraq Brief, and they were actually just beating the drum for war, and never mind that there is no evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. But then you go, you do it, you kill, you destroy, and so on, and you challenge the real numbers. We all remember Rumsfeld and what he said. And his known unknowns and known knowns and all that stuff about the Iraq War. Until this day, we don't know how many people died in Iraq. During that invasion. And later on, as a result of the Civil War and so on, more people, but as a cause of the invasion is a huge number. We never knew. I was in Iraq as a United Nations spokesman from 2005 to 2010. And we would hear, I would travel around Iraq and so on, and we would hear, way in the distance, not the fighter jets and so on, but these heavy bombers dropping the heavy bombs somewhere. We don't know. We don't know what they did. We don't know their effect and so on. There's never really an account for that. So they don't feel, they are accountable. So this is the tradition. And, the issue and by the way, I have just to bring in Syria because it is so much in the news. I mean, in Syria, the plan was all along to destroy Syria. I mean, we had U.S. ambassadors, I don't want to name names, but whether in Iraq or Egypt and so on, telling us that, this regime must go. And that's as early as 2004, 2005, 2006, and so on. So the plan was always there. And in fact, there was a peace deal arrived. I worked for a little bit for Kofi Annan and so on. And, when he quit, he basically said, look, there is a deal, but the Americans said, no, we want to have a regime change right away and so on. Or, and that was as early as 2012. I mean, despite where you stand or where you may stand on the issue of Syria. On Palestine, and I was, on Palestine, and I pose this question to you all. Maybe it's it's a new day, as Assad said. Maybe we'll see them begin to call the genocide a genocide, the spade a spade, and so on. Are they not going to be complicit with their governments? I don't believe so. I honestly don't believe so. I don't think, and Assad, to her credit, she was always changing the headlines on the New York Times or the other newspaper, which is fantastic. I mean, it's amazing what she does, how it should be. Well, not see it. I mean, we saw, as I mentioned in my introduction, we saw experts say this is a genocide. This is what's happening. These are criminal activities and events, and they happen day in and day out, and so on. My question to you all, that as long as we have this two-sided coin, every coin has two sides, of exceptionalism. You have exceptionalism for Israel and Israelis because it's their project. If the moment they lift that exceptionalism on Israel, that it can do whatever it wants, they have to hold Israel accountable. On the flip side, is the exceptionalism assigned to the Palestinian, and it's the negative exceptionalism. That the moment you begin to treat them as a human, the moment you begin to say they are occupied, then you have to do something about granting their right. So as long as you have this, do you see, any one of you or all of you, do you see this actually shifting anytime soon, where we begin to see some actual honest reporting on what's happening to the Palestinians?
I'm happy
Yeah.
to start. So I actually, I differ with both Prem and Asal on even the statement that was released today it was a joint statement that was released by the Associated Press, AFP, BBC, and Reuters. And yes, there are some great journalists who work there. There are great journalists who resigned from there over, especially at the BBC, which has been, as we know, repeatedly, BBC journalists have called out BBC's coverage again and again and again and again, which has dehumanized Palestinians, which has, refused to air certain documentaries and certain coverage and so on and so forth. But the actual statement's really interesting because I read it this morning because it was in every journalist WhatsApp group and Signal group, everyone's sharing it. Starts off great. It's a short statement, right? It's just talking about this is what's happening, it's unconscionable, et cetera, et cetera. Very strongly worded initially. And then it ends with only one demand. And it says, so it ends on 2 points. It says, journalists must be allowed, we urge that journalists be allowed in and out of Gaza. And then the statement never urges that food be allowed into Gaza. Instead, the statement ends with, it is essential that food enters, basic food necessity. It is essential that food enters Gaza for everyone. There's not an urgency that's presented there as well, right? And so for me, reading that, or as someone who has spent so many years really looking at how our news media talks about the words that they choose to use, that was a very deliberate choice that was used there, where they didn't say protect our journalists in Gaza, right? They said, we urge that that journalists are allowed in and out of Gaza, which is, if I'm not mistaken, that might be the first joint call news, and especially these many news organizations have actually made of the Israeli government, the Israeli government, because that is who's controlling the flow of in and out of Gaza, to actually allow international journalists into Gaza. So for me, a statement like this, to be honest, and again, this is not necessarily maybe a popular opinion amongst fellow journalists who are similar minded. It doesn't mean much to me, to be completely honest. And for me, a statement like that is also what I'll call, housekeeping, because we all see what's happening in Gaza and we know what is now inevitable. But why do we know it's inevitable? We see it, but also because we are being told by every single expert, every person, whether it's former USAID, whether it's the World Food Program, whoever it is, everyone's saying people are dying in the streets, they're collapsing, they're fainting. We know what's going to happen. And right now, what you're going to see and what you're going to continue, and we have seen this again and again happen, is that these exceptions to the rule, right, which is the rule of coverage, come out as a means of housekeeping. And for me, this was, I for a very long time, as someone who's engaged, and done media criticism for an extremely long time, I always believed that it was possible to reform these institutions by working within them as well, right? And pushing and so on and so forth. Over the last 2 years, I've come to not believe that at all. I don't think that these institutions are going to wake up tomorrow or even the day after, quote unquote, whatever that actually means for Palestinians, because I don't think there's going to be a day after. There'll be a day, sure, when maybe the guns aren't so loud and the bombs aren't so loud, but this is not something that just goes away either. But they're not going to just wake up one day and be like, yeah, that was a genocide, that was horrific, et cetera. They will do, we'll get like a New York Times, investigative piece in 20 years, maybe, if that paper is unfortunately still around, that will, be like, oh my God, these were the war crimes that were, committed, and the Biden administration did this, et cetera. Same thing that they did with the Iraq war coverage. No one was held culpable at all for what was criminal with the Iraq war coverage. No one. And people always say the New York Times apologized. It didn't apologize. If you read what the New York Times wrote, it was barely a mea culpa. it's barely an acknowledgement because what they said was they're like, oh my God, Judith Miller, she did some things that weren't that great, but we stand by most of our coverage. If that is the only type of accountability we received. We also live in a country which refuses to acknowledge its own genocide of its indigenous peoples. And there shouldn't be this expectation that is going to one day mourn the loss of the Palestinians it helped slaughter either. So that is the position I take, that unfortunately, and I don't mean this in like a pessimistic way. I think it's just more as someone who has come to, as many people has come to see what this all is and how our media functions as well, is that there are exceptions always, but the rule, unfortunately, is the dehumanization of Palestinians. It is the dehumanizations of Arabs, of Muslims, is the dehumanization of Black people, is the dehumanization of so many marginalized communities because this country, its institutions, and its imperial institutions around the world run on all of that.
Yes, definitely. You mentioned the New York Times, and that's a very good point and very good example because there was no apology there. It was saying, oh, okay, there was no weapons of mass destruction, and they moved on. And that's what happens with their story. But I'd like to hear, SL's take and Prim's take on this issue.
I'm happy to go and actually say that I largely agree with everything that Sana said. I don't, that's why I sort of dismiss the idea of this is not going to happen, but even if it did, they're still, even if all by some miracle everything shifted, they're still culpable for everything that's come to pass. So, but also it's not going to happen because, to your point, it's not, these institutions don't function that way. It's the same, it would be the same belief system as thinking all of a sudden our politicians, as they currently exist, are going to just change their minds and be less racist and not want empire. That's obviously not what's actually going to happen. But I think maybe the slight glimmer of hope is that some pressure from normal human beings, from like the public, is forcing them into a position where they have to say certain things. And that means that we are the levers of power. How we consume media, how we vote, how we protest, everything that we do that's really all we have. And so I think it's more indicative of the fact that as there is growing pressure, then they have to respond. They're not delusional, they're liars. It's not like they didn't know what was happening until now. They're just lying about it. And now here's the new way or the new linguistic gymnastics that they're coming up with to make it seem like they're actually human beings with souls and they care about what's happening to people across the world. So I absolutely agree with all of that. The institutions are the problem, and there doesn't seem, there's no reason for them to change. Why would you change? Why would Israel stop doing what they're doing? There's no reason, because there's no accountability. There are zero consequences. When there are no consequences, there's no reason for anybody to change behavior. And that's true of the media as well. There was no reckoning after the Iraq War. No one lost a job. No one was forced to resign. They all, failed upwards. So until there is accountability, and that accountability is going to come from the public. It's not going to, if the institutions themselves are the ones that are failing, then it's the public that has to hold them accountable. And that's what we really have to start to think about, beyond the sort of minutia of what we're dealing with every single day, but a look forward to how do we change the status quo?
Great point. And I just want to add something to what's being said. Look, the New York Times has basically instructions that it gives its reporters and its commentators, its columnists, and so on. You can't use the word genocide. You can't use the word occupation, among many other things. And until this thing changes, we're not likely to see any change. We're not likely to see it. Now, that is, they are great journalists. I mean, Prim and I our colleagues from these major establishment media outlets, they ask the right question.
We have one wonderful colleague right here.
There we go. Yeah. Hi, Rabia. So, so they ask the right questions, but, it doesn't make it to the CNN news. It doesn't make it to the CBS news. It doesn't make it, maybe sometimes it falls short. It makes it, but it falls short and so on. So the journalists do their job, especially the reporters. the institution itself, that is part of the establishment, and cater to them and see themselves first and foremost as a business, right? They see themselves that way, and they see themselves tied to the hierarchy of the structure, of the political structure, the economic structure, and so on. And until there is, some fundamental change, there is no, it's no mystery that whether it's the Wall Street Journal and or Bloomberg or the New York Times or others and so on, take these sometimes very hostile position, because if you read in the columnists, you read all these reporters and so on, they all have axe to grind. They all have, they all support Israel. I'm not, I don't want to say why they do or they don't, but in fact, because the whole system support this project that is basically a Western creation, right? Yeah.
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 I think one thing that all three of you wonderfully have established for us is we cannot put our hopes in these institutions that exist around us. Quite obviously, it's very patently clear. And so we're left with this inquiry of, so then what? What do we do, not just to cope, but to have some semblance of forward trajectory from where we are now, which is utterly useless institutions with regards to the structures themselves in the news media. And I think, to the term you were talking about housekeeping, and something Asal was getting at about these glimmers of hope, it's very true. I totally agree with you that even this statement from these four big news outlets is probably functionally housekeeping. But what I think is potentially interesting is when we look at episodes of housekeeping throughout the past 21 months and grading them on the sense of whether they were moments of housekeeping that were brought out of internal pressure from within the institutions versus pressure from outside of without the institutions. So for instance, one example I think of very often is when the Israeli military struck clearly marked World Central Kitchen vehicles. World Central Kitchen, of course, is affiliated with the founder, Jose Andres, a very beloved Washington, D.C. chef, a very, generally speaking, avid humanitarian, but very well respected in D.C. circles. That attack, of course, horrible, killed people from several countries, including one Canadian American, but it definitely garnered a lot of outsized attention, I think no less because of the intimate connection to a lot of actors within DC. It was an episode that stuck out for a moment, that prompted a lot of relatively strong statements and letters and words from members outside of the usual amount of people in Congress that are speaking out on the issue, including from the White House, the State Department, and so on. But of course, since then, humanitarians have been killed en masse. Americans have been killed, as we've seen. That was a moment of housekeeping that was prompted by internal pressures. This almost like internal reflexive sense that, well, I got to say something about this. It's the World Central Kitchen. It's Jose Andres. It's an American, and so on. And of course, people outside of Congress were also concerned about it, but it wasn't necessarily a particular moment in which some statistically significant mass in the American public were completely fixated on that episode. Whereas you think about moments like right now, there does seem to be a very large amount of people in the American public who are long concerned with the starvation conditions in Gaza, or are newly acquainted with them in a way that does seem like some form of critical mass that then prompts not just the big four news outlet statements, but very strong statements from other organizations that up to this point have been speaking out on the genocide, but maybe not finding their final words, so to speak. And I would say quite a few organizations have found their so to speak final words this week in terms of the absolute stakes of these times. And so I think one prism that's helpful when we think about these episodes of housekeeping is this question of where the pressure for the housekeeping is coming from. Because if it is external, that shows that there is some sort of movement that is different than before. Because with the internal pressure episodes, there is no policy change that accompanies that. any hope for some even whisper of a policy change must come from compulsion from a critical mass. And I guess one thing that does give me some level of optimism, even if it's a crumb, is that so much of this conversation obviously is about the failures and misdeeds of the establishment media, the mainstream media, the big box media. And it does seem more and more that that matters less.
Yeah.
That the mainstream media is becoming more and more amorphous, is becoming less and less monopolistic over the American public's views, the Western world's views on the rest of the world. And that's a good thing. If nothing else, because there's a lot of other journalists that I think are a bit better, but also maybe it'll force them to catch up. But it really does seem that this general sense of American skepticism that often just oscillates between voting for different people all the time is crystallizing into some broader critique of how this country has operated both inside and outside of its borders. And I'm not saying it's perfectly coherent and that there's a very stable anti-war movement in this country that like is coherent yet, but they are finding this level of new media. And I think we are giving them a literature and an understanding that then can lead to these kinds of episodes of external pressure that aren't just episodes anymore, but are steady states. And once we get to those steady states, that's when I think hope can be more than just something we grasp onto, but something that we're familiar with and that we are putting into motion. And so I think that is some level of optimism that I don't think is cheap, that I don't think is something that we're holding on to for the sake of coping. I think that is a very real dynamic and something that if we feed it, that reality and that change comes sooner.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's also with the media, especially the American establishment media. I don't know about other, British media or German media and so on in Gaza and in Palestine. I mean, there's never acknowledgement or recognition of the Palestinians that work for them. I mean, we have 220, at least 220 journalists that have been killed. None of these guys work for these establishments. They're not mentioned. They're not talked about. They're not brought in. I have a colleague, Alice Moody, who was in my newspaper, and he also, like most Palestinian journalists, is compelled to do so many things to earn a living, to feed his kids, and so on. That's just one thing. It's there's just no liquidity there, no funds, and so on. And he's the journalist that was hit with Shireen Abab, on the 20th. They first hit him. The bullet went through his body and so on. And that's how snipers work. There's a sniper and a spotter normally, and they want to see how the bullet goes and so on, So he was shot. He was, but he also works for so many other outlets that are Western, that are American, and so on. No mention of him. By the way, he's in prison now. They just put him in prison, and he was injured something like 6 or 7 times. I bring this point because there's also such racist dismissal of the people that they depend on. I mean, if you don't have people in Gaza, you're going to depend on those who are in Gaza, and they're the ones that are being killed. And this is not something new. It happened during the marches of return, if you recall, 2018 for 1 year and so on, and so many people were killed and all that. So there is that element. Prem raised the issue of social media, whatever you want to call it, new media and so on, and really does play a role. I teach a course on the role of media in the Arab world at the American University. And my students, they don't rely on this. They don't. They basically, none of them ever opened a newspaper. I mean, I try to encourage them just to feel the newsprint because that's, I still get my newspaper, I'm probably the last person, a dinosaur. But they get their media or they get their information from social media, from outlets and so on. But that is even being threatened, all the time. I mean, this is now certain groups and so on want to buy TikTok. One of them is Aikman. who's, with the guy that pulled out $50 million from Harvard because it allows, pro-Palestinian protests and so on. So that kind of group. So there's effort. There's going to be always effort to, to basically subvert what they're doing or to, so we don't know. Will they say, when you have such, you talked about stage 5, stage 5, which is right before people die, right? Do you feel that, once we have mass deaths, I mean, we have experienced in the 80s, the reporting and the commentary on what's happening in Ethiopia and other places and so on, the famine. And it gained a great deal of spotlight. Do you think that's going to be the watershed event, the moment where we can begin to see reporting and saying it is genocide? Look, people are dying. It's starvation, it's famine, all that stuff.
I think there have been so many moments in the last 2 years where I was like, this has to be it. There's
Yeah.
no way. We just saw this. It's on camera. It's caught. Like, there's no way that after this, that there isn't some sort of pushback. And what we find is the goalposts of, or the threshold for the cruelties just continues to increase. And I mean, the other thing to consider is who will tell us what is happening if also the journalists are dying of starvation? Like, who will show us? Because the only people showing us are Palestinian journalists in Gaza. And if they too, and look, I've been following so many of these journalists for the past 2 years as well. And every time they post themselves now, you can see the emaciation on their faces. You could see how much weight they've lost, right? And it's not, when you're in stage 5 of malnutrition, starvation, which, as you said, right, it's right before death. Your body can only go on for so long before you collapse, before you weaken. And so, I hope it's a watershed moment. I don't even know what that means right now. Do I think it will be based on everything that's happened so far? No, I think, yes, maybe you'll see some statements of, oh, we need to let aid in. Aid's not going to be enough. Aid is not going to be enough, especially when the majority are going to be children. As we know, when it comes to malnutrition, especially at this level, your body is broken down so much that it's not simply a case of you eating a chocolate bar or something and you're okay. I mean, very, very famously, and a really, horrific parallel, but like a true one, is that when the camps were liberated, when the camps were liberated after the fall of the Nazis, what was the first thing that a lot of the American soldiers, Soviets who went in, they started giving food to these, these human beings who were essentially just bags of skeleton. And what happened? Many of them died as a result because their body, yes, went into shock, could not handle the food because of how much they had been starved. And that's happened again. And we've seen, that's why when people go through famine and starvation, there is a protocol for, especially for children, there's a very specific protocol for how to feed them, but even for adults, it's there. The urgency of this moment is, I mean, it's very overwhelming to think about and talk about, because even if it is a watershed moment, even if tomorrow every news outlet is like, genocide in Gaza, let's say, right? It will not stop what has already been set in motion. And that is the thing for us to consider. I want to mention 2 really quick points for just things for us to take into consideration. The New York Times subscriptions since October 2023, like every single quarter since October 2023, their subscriptions have increased significantly. Not by like, oh, normal trajectory. In the first quarter of 2024, that they had the highest subscriptions they'd ever seen since they'd been taking record. That's something for us to also consider. We're talking about accountability for these institutions, because there's not going to be any kind of accountability from any other institution for one another. They're not going to hold each other accountable. But people are still subscribing to the United Nations. People are still subscribing to the New York Times. The second thing to remember is that under international law, media like the New York Times, like the Wall Street Journal, like CNN, like ABC, like CBS, like PBS, like all these organizations, PBS News, are culpable for their complicity, right? Der Stürmer, which was a Nazi propaganda outlet, Radio Rwanda, there is precedent for this. And these institutions, we have to look at them as in the same historical trajectory as all those other news institutions which spread the propaganda to slaughter other populations as well.
Thank you, Sonia. Wonderful. Would you like Asa and Prem to chime in on this before we go to the audience?
I mean, I'll just add, I think something, since we're talking about housekeeping and we talked about, Sana mentioned this in her opening remarks, that the starvation has gone through stages. Remember, one of the first statements from an Israeli official was no food, no water, no electricity. This has been the policy all along. And what you've seen happen is, because where does the media get their talking points? The media gets their talking points from the governments. And how do they get around these situations where, you know, suddenly there's a lot of pressure to act because people are seeing something horrific, there's public outcry, and now they have to respond to it. But in the political realm, we've seen this over and over again. So what'll end up happening is, you know, Israel will come to some agreement with the EU and the United States to let, quote, more aid in, and that will be the solution, when in fact the underlying issue is never resolved. And you can take that concept basically back to the so-called peace process. Like, what was the peace process? Everything was an excuse under the peace process. So what they try to do is use the language of international law, use the language of, we recognize that, you know, for instance, the West Bank is under occupation. We don't agree with that occupation. We just facilitate it by arming and funding it. So it's the disconnect between the language that they use and the actual policies. And that is where the media, that's why the media is so important. They don't question this. They just go along with whatever the talking points of the governments are. So what they'll end up doing is, even though right now you'll see these types of statements, tomorrow, if there's anything announced, anything, it doesn't even have to be real. That's the best part. It doesn't even have to be real. They just have to say they're going to do something, you know, open a crossing or let 100 aid trucks in, and that will be the new headline. The headline will be Israel lets in aid, even though it doesn't address anything that's actually happening on the ground, to the point that Sanaa was just making. I mean, this is not something that you can just fix with food. It's because it was a deliberate policy. So I think that's something important to always look for too, is that within the housekeeping, the talking points are coming from the politicians, and the politicians aren't blatantly telling you, yes, we're going to starve everybody to death. Like, they're not going to say that. That's not the language of colonialism. That's not the language of imperialism. They never say directly that's what they're doing. It's just that that's what they're doing, and we have to pick up on it. So that's the only thing that I kind of wanted to add, is that this type of language and the moving of the goalpost, that's how it works. But that will then become the story, rather than the real story, which is, this has been a deliberate policy all along.
Can I make one really quick?
Sure, yeah.
Oh, actually, no, sorry,
No,
Frank.
please.
Oh, no.
I want to make sure we get to questions.
I just want to really,
Gonna move to the audience.
a really important point to what Asal just said, because it's happening right now, and you're about to see it in the news. It's already been happening, but as we know, the Israeli government, the military, and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation have started pushing out this myth, this lie, that the reason why aid is not, they're like, their trucks are here. The trucks are there. It's the UN. 950 exactly. Trucks are there.
Yes, figure it out.
Yeah,
That is-
and the UN is not letting them in. The UN it's all in the UN, and they've been pushing this propaganda. And we've seen journalists like, for instance, Trey Youngs, who's Fox News foreign correspondent. Well, a lot of people have been like, wow, you know, Trey recognizes the humanity of Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. He's talked about Palestinian journalists. Trey Youngs has been pushing that as well, without even any kind of comment from the UN, when we know that the UN, several UN representatives have said, no, that's not the issue. The issue is that Israel has made it extremely complicated. They've completely dismantled the aid structure within Gaza that we were running. And also, they kill us. They kill UN aid workers, and there's no guarantee of the safety. So that's something to look out for as this famine worsens, as the starvation worsens, is that this is going to be, and this is exactly just to highlight the point that Asal was making, is that the talking points are taken directly from the Israeli government, the US government, and now GHF.
You wanna say something very quickly? You wanna-
No, let's
Okay.
pivot.
All right, with that, we are going to go to you. We'll start with you, right there. In the very, yeah.
Oh, from the beginning, is this working?
Yes.
Please, yes.
From the beginning, I think the answer
Can you
is,
say who you are and so on?
oh, my name is Mary Carrick. The answer is, you should ask who predominantly owns the media, legacy media in this country, and whose lobby owns our Congress and occupants of the White House. But the other group that no one is mentioning is the American war machine, sometimes called the military-industrial complex. And I think even more frightening is what these people have been trying to do is to drag us into a thermonuclear World War III with Russia, the rooting for that with the thing with Ukraine. And one of the worst people, I don't have cable, but I do get someone from CNN on PBS named Christine Amanpour, who has been a cheerleader for this. It's very frightening. But the other thing that is good news, I have read that as abysmal as the support and for the American Congress critters is most people don't trust this media. And there have been recent cases. Younger people are not supporting this Israel stuff. The Pope recently came out, condemned bombing churches. And I was shocked out of my mind to find out that Michael Huckabee has actually condemned what the Israelis are doing to Christians. I'm not sure if that's about the West Bank or if it's Gaza.
Yeah, all right, I wouldn't take what Michael Huckabee says as
Yeah.
anyway. You want to take
I mean,
that up?
That specific comment is actually interesting because Mike Huckabee is not only responding to the bombings of, excuse me, the attacks on Christians, but also as well, of course, Saif al-Masalab, a 20-year-old American who was killed in the West
Right.
Bank recently.
Right.
Mike Huckabee had actually issued quite a strong condemnation on that, calling it a terrorist act. And in his visit in the West Bank, where he was condemning attacks on churches, he also condemned attacks on mosques and other places of worship.
Right.
And so it's interesting, but lest we not forget who Mike Huckabee is and how committed he is to, firstly, not even necessarily accepting a Palestinian state, also to the annexation of the West Bank, to
Right.
the settlement project generally. He's very closely aligned with it. And so we'll see some of these statements like that, no less from people who are part of the evangelical Christian sort of community or allyship and fellowship there. It's puzzling. But to your first comment, I think you're absolutely right about the influence and nefariety and the just reach of the military industrial complex in such a way that, of course, we ought not forget it's also a revolving door within not just the press, but members of Congress, within people who go from Raytheon to being a staffer, to being a lobbyist, to maybe being a news assistant and so forth, in such a way that we get to the point that, regardless one's views on Russia, Ukraine, or any other conflict in the world, there is this default deference towards violence or war or action as a sort of euphemistic language of responding to things in such a way that to see an anchor just have a baseline skepticism of escalation or violence is very rare and very refreshing for a lot of people, no less a lot of young people. So totally take your point for sure.
You raise your arm. That just keep.
I watched the news last night. I saw a
point to the question,
criminal.
please. Just say.
I watched the news last night. I saw a criminal confessing. Then the justice gave him the choice to have life in prison instead of the death penalty. But in 1976, in 77 in France, they couldn't condemn Patrick Henry, the infamous Patrick Henry, because the death penalty was abolished in France. So what we have to do now is to abolish the death penalty. I don't call it genocide. I call it the death penalty on the innocent people. So we have to abolish the death penalty. I grew up after the World War II, 8 years after World War II. I still saw the sign, and I have German blood. I have a grandmother German. So I knew they did a genocide, they say, in Germany, and I visited the only concentration camp in France, and I knew evil existed.
Thank you. Let's take another question. We'll go right there. Okay. We have to go because give you a mic, and then we'll go to Brian.
Hi, I'm a lawyer, so I approach this from kind of a different angle. And I know a lot of people in this space have been saying the international legal system has failed. We've touched on, or the international institutions have failed. And so I just wanted to bring a little bit of a different perspective to, I think we all have a role in this. And if you look at, I've been studying atrocities over the past 100 years. And if we look at the atrocities that have happened, you know, we talk about World War II a lot, but there was the juntas in Argentina, there were the disappearances in Turkey. You have many examples all over the world. What typically happens is we do not stop the atrocity. That's not what the international system has been built to do. And if you think about it in just a very basic sense, a legal sense, what happens just when somebody gets murdered, right? There is the crime, there is the investigation, the legal system is at the end, the accountability is at the end. So when you look at these situations, like I will take the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, you need social change. And that's where the journalists and the truth finding is important, because this is how we get social change. The social change then brings the political change, and the political change then leads to the ability to have legal accountability, right? We look at the Sierra Leone war crimes tribunals that came 10 years after the Civil War, the Sierra Civil War. So I think the question that we need to be thinking about at this moment is how do we get, what information can we present to the public, and how do we reach the most amount of people to be able to start getting the truth out that will then lead to the social change and the political change. And maybe we're not going to change politicians' minds. I don't think Randy Fine is going to change his minds. What we need to do is we need to get the people in his district to change their minds, so we change the politician, right? And then the politics and the international politics can lead to the legal accountability, and that will be much, much later, right? And so one of the last point I want to touch on is when we think about people like Pierce Morgan is a really good example. You know, I'm not saying embrace these far right people who have, you know, who have said terrible things, anti-Semitic things. We know why they're coming to this, not Pierce Morgan, but the other ones, Candace Owens or whatever. But I do think we need to think about Pierce Morgan. Maybe he's being cynical. Maybe he's actually had a change of heart, but he's reaching other people. And maybe his audience doesn't know that he's being cynical, or he's just doing this for housekeeping purposes, or whatever, you know, you're saying. So I just think that's kind of a frame we need to think about, is how, to what extent do we want to not welcome these people into the tent, but just give them a little bit of grace to at least say, okay, you know, I will accept what you're saying on this issue. You are reaching a better audience. We can use you to get the change that we want.
Yeah.
Can I?
Yes,
So-
Sorry, so is it okay if I actually comment on something from the
Yeah,
beginning of the
absolutely.
statement? It's interesting to think about from a legal perspective, to think about it as, well, you know, first a murder is committed and then we investigate the murder and we hold the criminals accountable. To some extent, that is true. But the international system, I mean, if you look at the UN Charter, like the most basic, I think it's like the first or second sentence of the UN Charter, is to avoid the scourge of war. So the entire point of the UN is to stop this from happening. And in fact, I would push back just a little bit, because I would say one of the problems with the way that the term genocide is being talked about is, until the International Court of Justice, which will take years, concludes and says that Israel is guilty of genocide, then it just stands as an accusation. And that's not how it works, nor should it work that way, because under that logic, we're waiting for them to be done with their genocide before we actually stop it from happening. So there are mechanisms within that system that would stop Israel right now. And the thing is if it was, let's say, Iran or Russia or China were doing what Israel is doing right now. In fact, why use it as an abstract example? How many times have they put sanctions on Russia over the last 3 years? Repeatedly. I think they just released the 18th sanctions package on Russia. There isn't one sanction on Israel. There isn't even a condemnation officially from the UN. So there are mechanisms in place to actually prevent what is happening from happening, those levers of power, and that's the purpose of those institutions. So and I agree, by the way, with the point about legal recourse in the aftermath, accountability is extremely important, but even that failed if you look at the Iraq example that we were talking about. So there's supposed to be, once the crime is committed, the crime has been committed over and over again. It's just that if you look at the ICC cases, I think it's predominantly African countries, right? So it's going back to the question of racism, like these institutions are actually meant to operate in a particular way. They're just not doing it. And I would disagree with the idea that we have to wait until the crime has been committed until we act on it.
Brian.
Hi, thank you all for your great speeches. I'm Brian Barber. I've had the privilege of immersing myself in Palestine for many decades. The first lesson I learned on my first trip in 1994 was to not trust anything I read or heard any longer, because the realities on the ground were so discrepant from what I was reading and being taught by pundits of all sorts, whether that be to the quality or the intentions or the vision of the people, or whether it be regarding specific events that just happened that are not being covered honestly. So it's kind of depressing today to hear that things are no better. I knew that, of course, but to hear you all say it so specifically is a little difficult. So I'd ask you a question theoretically, maybe. I mean, I don't pick up from any of your comments that you think this is going to change anytime soon. And from Sana's citation of the New York Times subscription rate, that argues against that even. So put on your hats, your people in the trenches. What are the main obstacles towards getting this to change? What would have to change in order for us to be able to have a more trustworthy main media?
I think we're seeing some of those obstacles play out in recent weeks and months with regards to the sort of reactionary behavior of some of these interests and institutions. So for instance, a very concrete example that's tangentially related is the election of Zohran Mamdani. Of course, he has not been formally elected yet. He still has to win the general election, but the ways in which Israel allied interests and individuals, especially very powerful ones, had already pulled out all the stops to prevent his election from happening and are still trying to throw together whatever they can to prevent him from winning, shows, I don't want to go as far as to say the final breaths of these powers, even if he wins, because they'll still fight tooth and nail every day. They'll spend way more money trying to undermine him than the amount of money they'll probably be taxed by him. But I think the continual losses of those people and those interests, if they continue to lose on whether it's a New York City mayoral election or broader sort of mechanisms and debates and dynamics on just the way the public engages and trusts the media, I think those losses alone would indicate some display of the change that is required. That the change will not happen unless these people continue to lose. And I know that seems circular in certain respects, but it's a sort of sufficient condition that would show what I think I was sort of getting at earlier, which is the fact that like there is this sort of baseline distrust that I think is there in America generally, and sometimes we see it exploited to maybe some of the worst impulses we have as a society, but sometimes that can be activated, as we've seen perhaps in Zohran Mamdani, for something that's a bit more hopeful, it's a bit more humanistic, that's a bit more interested in the idea that the way this country functions now does not have to be how it functions tomorrow. And so I think every person in this room has a stake in that, not only in terms of the consequences of that, but the fact that we should help shape those stakes. As observers, as lawyers, as neighbors, as community members, as journalists. The New York Times is an institution. CNN is an institution. Fox News is an institution. Congress is an institution. Mm-hmm. But we too are part of this country just as much as they are. We too are part of this society just as much as they are. And I think the more that we act like it and know that to be true, the less power they're going to have. And so some of that might seem abstract, but some of it very much is not, in terms of how we're seeing people engaging with the media in a different way than they had before, in a way that does seem a bit more focused and skeptical and curious, if nothing else. And the more we embrace that curiosity and indeed welcome people that maybe would not have seen eye to eye with us before, the quicker that happens. And I think there is space and room for that. And I think there are actual exhibits of that project not only being tried, but having success.
I think the point made about, you need to change in what kind of representative or what kind of politician is elected and so on. And that is changing. The base is changing somewhat, but until then, not much is going to happen. I mean, for 25 years, I've been told in the State Department, when I surveyed, I say, look, there was a demonstration, and there were 1 million people demonstrating against the war in Iraq. And the standard answer is, we don't do policy by public opinion.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
by polls or something like this. So keep that in mind. We'll take last 2 questions, one here and one there, and then we'll take you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that'll be, it'll be, yeah, but please make it short and make it
Sure.
in the form of a question.
Thank you all so much.
Take it all together.
Yeah. Can you comment on how the mainstream media facilitates and stokes ethno-nationalist tensions in West Asia and movements, whereas, people like my people, the Kurds, or Druze, or others do have legitimate grievances of what we've been through, but still that is pounced upon by the establishment here along with the media. So could you please elaborate more on that?
We'll take the second question right there. Right behind you. Yeah, pass it on.
Yeah, a little context. I wasn't sure if I was going to speak, but you brought up Jose Andres, and sometimes I talk about this out of context on Sana's IG lives, but I ran ops for Jose Andres for 5 years, and Zami Frankham, the Australian, was my ex-partner and best friend. And if you follow World Central Kitchen and Jose and their voice, you'll see that he minimizes what's happening there. When WFP says people are dying in the streets, Jose says, look at what I did today. Look at what we did today. And on Sunday, as the leaflets were falling along with the bombs, he tweeted out, oh, I hear there's a little bit of like a security strain right now. And he has not signed on with any of the other organizations, the 111 who went against the GHF, and the 169 who just put out whatever. But that's to say, he is part of the, we used to joke internally, it's a media organization with an aid problem. And he is somebody who has a huge voice, more than most of these other hundreds of organizations, if you look at his audience. And he is somebody who's brought on to legitimize these other media organizations and tell the stories. And he's not telling the story, though. And so I guess I would love to hear how you feel about organizations on the ground who trade their voice just to be there under, working directly with IDF, COGOT, and CLA, and what their responsibility is too, because this will all end badly and they'll move on to the next thing and raise more money on it.
Can you pass it on? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Augusta Salzona, Asian, Pacific, Filipino, Catholic American. Been in this town since 1955, family, extended family. Okay, so it's
been around.
perspective. Yes, a worldview. Recently I identified as a traditionalist Catholic, and yes, I was one of those investigated. But anyway, basically the question sort of and suggestion is here. Those of you who will deal with the documentation of this, whatever war crimes, genocide crimes come up, look to those investigative journalists, the ones who favored the United States basically not ratifying the ICC, the 1998, the Rome statutes. Go directly to that. And also contact, as you can, you'll probably have to use back channels. Pope Leo, the statements which he's come out and say, and as far as the turning point in terms of assassins and all that, what basically, at least for me personally, and I kind of took it personally, and then that's when but the killing of the mother and daughter seeking refuge
Yeah.
in the Gaza church, which happened shortly. That tells you something, and how very, very powerful the legacy media is about not bringing that up. But they notice in the Vatican and with this new pope. So that's a good thing, and establish and try to avoid getting into the political aspects, even ideological aspects
Mhm.
of this. That's my suggestion. I mean, I hear a lot of
Mhm.
kind of left stuff. I mean, this is basically human rights. I mean, when you're talking about genocide, I mean,
Most people-
it's not really.
It's hard to eat.
Yeah, focus on the facts. Focus on the facts.
Thank
Well, thank you. Perhaps we can have you respond to these questions as part of your concluding remark, everyone. I just want to mention something that Prim really is the person that raised the story of the young girl, Hind Rajab, day after day after day in the State Department. So, kudos to you to what you have done, and the story still. Thank you. So we'll begin with Asal, go to Sana, and then end both of them.
I actually think the last point on the Pope and the recent bombing of a Christian church in Gaza, a Catholic church in Gaza. What was interesting in the way that, not interesting, I should say, but what was part of the same pattern of the way that the media portrayed that is what was leading the stories. First of all, when it first happened, it wasn't being attributed to Israel. But then once it was clear that this is getting a lot more attention because it's Christians that are being attacked rather than Muslims that are being attacked every single day. But once it garnered more attention, you got Netanyahu, because Trump got on the phone with him and said, "Hey, why are you killing Christians? You're only supposed to be killing Muslims." And you had a statement from Netanyahu. That became the story. The story became Israel regrets. Now, here's the problem with that. They called it a stray ammunition, right? This was another accident. Israel has a lot of accidents, apparently. But what was interesting in this particular, looking at it from the Christian perspective, is that Israel has repeatedly not only attacked churches there was a reference to the mother and daughter that were killed in a church. I think it was November of 2023. Right? November of 2023. So this has been a consistent pattern because they've also done it in Lebanon. Like, this isn't only happening against Palestinians. Israel was attacking holy sites, Christian and Muslim, in Lebanon as well. There's video of Israeli soldiers desecrating mosques, desecrating churches, ripping out pages of the Quran, burning them. I mean, it's a repeated pattern because there's one thing that we don't like to talk about, or we do, but at least the media and the entire political perspective doesn't like to talk about, and that is the entire ideological outlook of the state of Israel, which is Jewish supremacy. It's never talked about as religious extremism. We don't talk about the fact that there's accounts of Christians in Jerusalem being spit on by Israelis. I mean, this is something that happens repeatedly, and yet that is not part of the narrative. So you have this moment where clearly you can draw a pattern and a line which is connected. If you wanted to contextualize it, if you were the media and you wanted to add context, it would be, well, because this is an entity that believes in Jewish supremacy, but that's not the way that it's presented. It's presented not only as sort of an isolated incident, but worse, from the Israeli perspective, that it's an accident. So I thought that was another example where it got attention, partially because it was a Catholic church that was being attacked, but still you see the way that it is framed in the media. I mean, in a closing remark, that would just be the summation of the entire problem, that we're not going to the root of the issue, that we're not talking about, even when we talk about Gaza, of course, a genocide and the horrors that we are seeing unfold every day is vitally important that we talk about it every day. But we have to understand it within a larger context. And I've seen Said, I remember this, Said bringing up this very point to Matthew Miller and saying, but this didn't start on October 7th. And what was the logic that Miller used? The logic that Miller used was, no, Said, you can't talk about anything before October 7th because nothing before October 7th justifies October 7th, but October 7th justifies everything thereafter. That illogic the core of it reduces it to the fact that Israel is always correct and is always a victim, and Palestinians are always the aggressor and can never be a victim. And that's just because it's based on a racist ideology. And it will always be that way until you address that racist ideology at the center of it.
Thank you.
I'm going to be quick because I know
Yeah.
some folks got to run to
Yeah.
State Department briefings here. So really quickly, you had asked a question about how U.S. News media kind of engages with West Asian ethno-nationalism. I'm not sure if I entirely understand the question. We can talk about it after as well. But I will say that generally, and this is part of U.S. history, whether because U.S. News media does take its cues from again U.S. foreign policy, but there is a very obvious tendency to support and reactionary forces in any region. And actually, the blueprint for this was Central America, right? The blueprint for a lot of that kind of support for reactionary forces that go after minority groups as well, but then also their own groups at some point as well, so on and so forth. That is rooted very much in a blueprint that was created within Latin America during, of course, the late 1970s and the 1980s. Regarding your question about organizations on the ground and how they have to work with the IDF, and then what responsibility do they have when they come back? Well, they have all the responsibility in the world, morally, politically, to be truthful about what they're saying. The problem is like whether it's someone like Jose Andres or it is CNN or Fox News correspondents who are embedded, which is, I think, anyone will tell you the stupidest thing as a journalist, in my opinion, right? And many people will say to be embedded as a journalist with with any military, to be embedded with them. I mean, all you're doing is propaganda for them. And also, as we know, they have to have their footage. If you're a journalist and you're embedded with the IDF, you have to have your footage seen with the IDF has to look through it and tell you that it's okay, you can talk about this, etc. Now, they have a responsibility to be truthful, but they won't be. They will never be fully truthful because they can't be, because that would completely take away their access, which is what a lot of these organizations are reliant on, right? Which is also why you see a lot of people who have seen the horrors in Gaza, and when they come out, because of the organizations they're affiliated with, they can't use certain terminology. They also can't always, some of them have changed over time as things have worsened, but very early on, I remember watching doctors who were going into Gaza and coming out, and they were affiliated with certain hospitals or certain aid groups. They could not say it was an Israeli airstrike. They could not use the word Israel. They could not attribute blame to Israel, not because they didn't believe it or because of some ideological, stall, but because they knew by saying that, by saying Israel explicitly, it would put their organization in danger, not just in danger from the Israelis themselves, but also in danger from like donors, right? Who's giving them the money? So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. And last comment I'll make is, I think in this moment, everything that we consume, we need to be consuming with a critical eye. In 2020, there was a poll done, this was before COVID. In 2020, there was a poll done that showed that American trust in the news media was at an all-time low. It was 32%. It was 32% in 2020. And I haven't seen if there's been a recent poll recently, but I can probably take a really good guess that it's even lower than that today. Right. And more Americans, especially younger Americans, but also older Americans, are turning to alternative media forms, podcasts and streams like Twitch streams or wherever else, people are streaming and whatnot there, or YouTube. And which is great, but it's also scary because if we're relying on these other platforms, we've also seen how these platforms, whether it's Twitter, X, or Meta platforms like Facebook and Instagram, is how tightly they're controlled by an algorithm, but not just an algorithm, but also policies that are all being created by some people who are also formerly affiliated with the Israeli government, right? We know, I'm forgetting the name of there are two individuals in particular who work on content moderation at the lead of it, and both of them are former IDF soldiers who are at Meta right now, right? And that's been a long time coming, by the way. That's not nothing new. That's been at least 10, 15 years in the making. So, we are entering an interesting space for information dissemination right now. which is both, I think, good, but also very scary. And it's just as it is our responsibility more than ever before as news consumers. If you want to be an informed public, that means we need to, everything we consume, including with those who we agree with, we have to be really critically engaged. That doesn't mean like criticize everything, right? It means critically engage with what you're listening to, terminology that's being used, how something is being framed. And that's it. That's really all I could say is that more than ever before, we can't be passive consumers of information. We need to be actively engaged.
Yeah.
I don't want to belabor any points, especially because what both of you have said was excellent and perfect and the right way to end things here. I think I just want to have one more moment to recognize where we are right now, which is that it's a horrific week in Gaza and a very, very horrific week for our colleagues that are doing
Yeah.
the best work that they can be doing, but also the kind of work that we can only hope to meet the standard of. And as you all have said, they're fighting for a couple calories a day.
Mm.
And as we air out our frustrations and our anger and our fury at the world that's allowed that to even exist, we must also acknowledge that they're still somehow waking up the next day, looking for another one. And it is incumbent upon us to make sure that they're not alone in seeking that day out. And I know there's a lot of compassion and care in this room for that very goal. I know that the people that I share this table with and this screen with are very not only aware of that, but are role models for me in trying to accomplish that. And so I just want to make sure that we maybe just close out today with their lives and their pursuits for living as dignified lives as we like to live can be honored, and that we will live to see the day that they get to have that too.
Thank you, Prem. Thank you, Asam. Thank you, Sana. For these compelling presentations, very profound presentations, and it affects us. And obviously, we could talk about this issue for a much longer time and so on. And hopefully, we'll do it again. So thank you all, and please, big. Thank you.
Thank you, Said, by the way,
Yeah.
for moderating.
Thank you. Right. And of course, I thank everybody that came.